Well, hi everybody, and welcome to my week 7 video. And this time around, I'm going to talk to you about paper 2. I'm going to review the paper 2 assignment sheet with you, and then I'm going to talk with you about the elements of poetry. So these are two important documents that will really help you to do well on this next upcoming major paper. So please follow along with me. Go to Content up at the top of our Brightspace course page, and then in the left-hand sidebar, look for Major Paper Assignments and Related Materials, and then click on Paper 2, and let's review this document first. So for this paper, you'll be writing an explication, hard to say, but to make it easier for you, just think explanation, because when you explicate something, essentially you're just explaining it in detail of a poem. And it will explain, it will interpret the poem for your reader in order to demonstrate a clear understanding of the details, the underlying meaning, which of course is the theme, techniques used to produce that meaning, and content, and any other unique or important aspects of that poem. So you'll just write a general explication or explanation of a poem we've studied together in Unit 2 that develops a central idea as expressed in your thesis statement, which should come at the very end of your very first introductory paragraph. And that thesis tells us what your paper is going to do and what it's going to be about. So there are several important dates that I've listed here for you. The first one is Wednesday, the 24th of March, and that will be our idea workshop day for paper 2. So you'll go up to the assignments tab up at toward the top of our course page and look for idea worksheet for paper 2. Follow the instructions there. And you want to upload before 11:59 p.m. on Wednesday, the 24th of March. And that step in the process just basically allows you to begin to think about this paper and how you might want to organize it, what your main points might be, etc. And then the next important date is Monday the 29th, and that's our pre-writing day for paper 2. So we will not have a rough draft and peer review situation anymore, because there just aren't, frankly, enough hours in the day for me to comment specifically on rough drafts and on the actual final papers as well. So I only do that for the first one in this course. But we will have a pre-writing day. And so you want to post in the week 11 discussion board pre-writing for paper 2. And that's where you'll submit a pre-written introductory paragraph with a thesis at the end and a little informal outline. It doesn't have to be anything fancy or formal, in which you just basically lay out 3 main points. And I will give you feedback on that intro, that thesis, and those 3 main points. You want to submit before 11:59 on Monday night, the 29th of March. And remember that just like the rough draft for paper 1, if you do not submit this pre-writing material by the deadline, then 10 points will be deducted from your paper 2 grade. And then the final draft of paper 2 comes due on Monday, the 5th of April. And it must be submitted no later than 11:59 p.m. on Monday, which is the 5th. So after receiving feedback from me on your intro, your thesis, and your outline, submit that final draft via the Assignments tab. Look for Paper 2 Final Draft. And remember that with those final drafts, 10 points are deducted from your paper grade for every calendar day that it is late, and that includes the day that it is due, and weekends, and papers are not accepted after 5 days. So make sure you get it in. So the specifics, this paper should be 3 to 4 pages in length, and so a minimum of 3 full pages. If you don't have that, some points are going to be deducted. You can certainly go over the 3 pages. You don't want to just ramble on and on just to be rambling, obviously. but you must get to a minimum of 3 full pages. Obviously, you're going to type the paper, double space it in Times New Roman 12-point font with standard margins. And for this assignment, you only need to document to cite your main source, the poem that you are analyzing. But I strongly encourage you to add a second source. I strongly encourage you to do it. It will make your paper better. That offers a literary critique of your poem, or that comments perhaps on some technique that you're seeing at work in this piece. And you can find a lot of good information through the library's databases. You'll need to incorporate line quotations and paraphrasing. You must cite within your paper and on a separate works cited page in MLA formatting. If you don't do that, then serious points will be deducted. So your goal in paper 2 is to write that careful explication, again think explanation, of a poem of your choosing, as long as it is one that is listed on our syllabus in Unit 2. And so that's the poetry unit. So if you're all confused and you're saying, well, when is Unit 2? Look at your course syllabus. Go to Content, and right under Table of Contents, you'll see Course Syllabus. Click on it, and you'll see that Unit 2 began on Monday, the 1st of March, the day that Paper 1 came due, and it ends on the day that the final draft of this paper comes due. So look at your syllabus, and all of the poems in that poetry unit that we've read together, any one of them would be fair game. So you want to notice each technique that the poet is using, and you'll look back at that Elements of Poetry document that we are going to be discussing here in just a moment for help. And also you want to pay careful attention to and address matters such as symbolism. What objects are you seeing, or ideas are you seeing within the poem that might be symbolic of something deeper? You can address things like sound and rhythm and tone. And finally, at some point, be sure to address the ways in which this poem reveals some aspect of our class theme, which is, of course, enslavement. So to create a successful paper, here are the questions you should be thinking about as you're writing. And again, don't take me literally and answer these questions in your essay, as one student did in the past, but consider these things as you're writing to keep you on track. Have I selected a poem listed in Unit 2 of our syllabus? So if you pulled one from out of a hat that's not in our syllabus from the poetry unit, then you're probably going to make a 0 on the paper. Have I written a compelling thesis statement? So for example, your thesis needs to say something more meaningful than the poem Why Do We Sing by Mario Benedetti is very beautiful. Well, okay. Tell us more about the poem. Tell us maybe the theme it's revealing, or, tell us something about it that is more interesting and unique than that. And avoid those vague words like beautiful and good. Your idea of beautiful and the reader's idea might be two different ideas. Have I checked my topic sentences? So the first sentence of each paragraph, to be sure I'm making points of analysis, of explanation, right? Rather than just summarizing what's happening in the poem. So for example, if I look at the first sentence of my paragraphs and I'm seeing sentences like, next the narrator states that people sing because cruelty has no name. And then next he says they sing because of the child. So that sounds as if maybe you're just writing a summary of what's happening in the poem rather than explaining what it means, how it reveals the theme. And the techniques that the poet is using. So we don't want a plot summary of what's happening. Rather, we want an explication. Think explanation of matters like technique and theme. So does my introductory paragraph, my very first paragraph, begin with a hook? So some line that serves to make your reader want to keep on reading. And have I included the following information in that introductory paragraph? The title of the work, and remember, poetry titles are almost always placed in quotation marks, so you want to do that consistently throughout your paper. And if you include the title of the poem as part of your title, you're going to put that other author's title in quotation marks. So we want the title of the work, we want the full name of the author in your intro, the reason that this poem has meaning, and your thesis at the very end of it. Have I remembered that poetry titles are generally placed in quotation marks? Have I remembered to refer to the author by last name only after I've introduced him or her fully in my intro? So in my intro, if I'm writing about Barbie doll, for example, I'll call the poet Marge Piercy, her full name. But after that, I will not call her Marge. I will not call her Mrs. Piercy. I will call her Piercy, because that is standard protocol for academic writing, and it makes me sound like an academic writer who knows what I'm doing, right? Have I used literary present tense? So remember, we talked about this before with paper 1. Because literature exists in perpetuity, it can be read again and again and again. The stories and the characters always exist. So we use present tense when we're referring to the characters and their actions. So, for example, Benedetti uses interesting sentence structure to explain the reasons for the tenacity and courage of his people. His use of unfinished sentences mirrors his open-ended sense of hope for a future filled with possibilities. So we wouldn't use used or mirrored past tense. We're going to stay in present tense. Have I used formal academic language? So I'm not going to use informal language like I'm sitting around talking to one of my friends or like I'm texting, right? No, that's not appropriate for college level writing. Do I have correct in-text, also called parenthetical citations? So I need quotations from the lines of the poem and paraphrased ideas where I'm putting the ideas into my own words in MLA formatting, and I have to cite them at the end. So in parentheses, after a quote or after a paraphrase, I have to have the poet's last name and then the line number. So in poetry, I use line numbers, not page numbers, because poems are smaller works and they normally only appear on 1 or 2 pages. Do I have that separate works cited page at the end of my paper? If I don't, I'm going to have some major points deducted. Have I used diagonal marks to indicate when I'm quoting from the poem where the lines in the poem are separated from one another? So I'm going to use space, diagonal space to indicate that. Have I been careful not to plagiarize? Have I included those quotes and incorporated them smoothly into my own sentence structure? So remember, if a quote appears in my paper all by itself as a sentence, it's a dropped quote, and there are going to be point deductions for that. So here's an example. Benedetti repeatedly poses the rhetorical question of why the Uruguayan people sing despite the desperation of their motherland's political struggles, : and then the quote, if those who are ours are left without an embrace, space, diagonal space, our motherland is almost dead of sadness, space, diagonal space, and the heart of man is blown to pieces, space, diagonal space. Before shame exploded, space, diagonal space, you will ask, why do we sing? And then in parentheses, those line numbers. So let's say if those were lines 7 through 10, I could put 7-10. If I had been skipping around lines and had used 7 and 10, but not 8 or 9 in between, then I could do 7, 10, right? I don't have to put Benedetti's name there because I mentioned him in my attribution. I mentioned him in my sentence. And note that if that colon after the word struggles had been turned into a period, guess what? My quote would be dropped. It would appear as a sentence all by itself, and I would get some big time points deducted. I can use the colon method because my sentence before that quote is an independent clause. It's a complete sentence. If I only had part of a sentence before the quote, I'd have to use a comma. Do I have a fully developed intro, body, and conclusion? Have I at some point answered the question, so what, who cares? Why does this poem that I'm writing about really matter? How does reading it help make us better people or wiser people? Have I included an analysis of the poet's language? So is it really formal? Is it sarcastic? Is it using words that are very elevated, or is it more common everyday speech? The rhythm of the poem. So is it sort of just like this with a normal rhythm? Or does it rhyme? Or is it free verse without any rhyme? What's the tone of the piece? What's the style? Look at that Elements of Poetry document that we're going to talk about in just a moment for ideas. Have I made a connection at some point within my essay, doesn't matter where, just at some point, regarding the way in which the idea of human enslavement in some form is expressed in this poem? So now I give you examples of a possible thesis and game plan for paper 2. So here's the first example. In Mario Benedetti's moving poem, Why Do We Sing?, the poet poses the rhetorical question of why the Uruguayan people may continue to sing despite the hardships they have undergone. The second half of the poem proceeds to answer the question, offering multiple varied reasons for the ongoing song of the people. After a careful explication of Benedetti's poem, analyzing the imagery used, along with the denotations and connotations of the poet's language, one may argue that the poet uses the concept of singing as a metaphor for his people's resilience and endurance. Now, this is not one that we're actually reading together, but it is a beautiful poem. So it's not one that you can use for this paper, but it's a good example. So for this kind of thesis, I'm going to need to consider every word of the poem, and not just its literal dictionary meaning, its denotative meaning, but its figurative connotative meanings. What associations do these words carry with them? And what's the driving metaphor? Well, it's the idea of singing, right? And that's actually a metaphor for the people's strength and their ability to endure through so many tragedies. So how do the analogies compare to each other that the poet is making? How are they similar? How are they different? And I'm going to consider, is this poet using rhyme? What's the rhythm of the poem like? Is it just in perfect meter or not? In uncovering the author's underlying themes. And I'm always going to always talk about theme, probably in my thesis, because that's the most important thing that we need to get at. Here's a second example with a poem we are reading together. Martin Espada's lyrical poem, so you can tell me what kind of poem it is. If it's lyrical, and we're going to learn about this a little bit later in the course, that means it's a poem that focuses on emotion rather than necessarily telling a story. Martin Espada's lyrical poem, Of the Threads That Connect the Stars, begins with a question posed by a father to his son. Did you ever see stars? And notice that I've used line 1 there because I'm quoting. While the reader initially expects the poem's subject matter to focus on heavenly stars, one quickly grasps the fact that instead, the speaker initially refers to the stars one sees when being hit hard in the face during a fist fight. As the poem continues, Espada metaphorically connects 3 generations of Puerto Rican American men following their journey to become Americanized. A thorough explication of this work reveals the family's ascent through the generations from that of the grandfather, a struggling immigrant in Brooklyn, to the speaker's own son, a young astronomer who now sees stars in a new and significant way. So the thesis is that this poem chronicles the family's ascent through these 3 generations using stars as the connecting metaphor. So to create an effective paper from that kind of thesis, you're going to need to demonstrate through quotes and through paraphrases how that use of the word stars sets up this metaphorical journey of the family's experience through the generations in the poem. So you've got to consider each word, not just the dictionary meanings, but the connotative meanings behind the words. Look carefully at the symbolism within the poem. Is it universal? Is it cultural? Is it contextual? Is it all of the above? So how, for example, does the symbol of the stars connect maybe with the idea of the stars and stripes in the American flag? Because we're talking about an immigrant family becoming Americanized through the generations. Consider the emotions within the language. What larger meanings and implications does this poem set forth regarding the challenges that are being faced by immigrant families? So that's the paper 2 assignment sheet. And now let's take a moment to look at the other important sheet for this week, and that is the elements of poetry. So you'll want to go to course documents, and you'll have to go down and hit load more at the bottom of the page, and then click on the elements of poetry. So poetry is, if we're going to define it, characterized by the presence of imagination, emotion, universal truth, and sensory impressions. So sight, sound, smell, touch, taste, right? It's expressed rhythmically and usually in an orderly arrangement of parts. And it expresses within itself a unity. So it's written for the main purpose of providing aesthetic and emotional pleasure and or response. So you see some well-known definitions here by famous writers. Poe called it the rhythmical creation of beauty, and our friend Wordsworth said that it was the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. Arnold called it a criticism of life, and Carlyle, I think this is my favorite, called it musical thought. Hunt said it's the utterance of a passion for truth, beauty, and power. And Shelley said it's the record of the best and happiest moments of the best and happiest minds. And that's true. But it's also the record of some of the worst and most terrible moments of some of the best and most depressed minds as well. So it's not all roses and lollipops, as you will see. So what are the basic elements of poetry? Now, these ideas are ideas you can and should write about in paper too, right? So put it together. So imagery is an element that all poets are going to use. These are words that call upon our senses, and that they're referred to as images, and the technique is referred to as imagery. So, obviously almost all words create images, but a good poem will set forth an exact original image. So ask yourself, what are the images that this poem is giving me? An analogy is an extended comparison. So the poem may be making an extended comparison between the stars and what's happening in 3 generations of Puerto Rican men who have become Americanized, right? The poem may use personification. Think of my cat, Princess Fufu, who is fortunately asleep in the living room and has not interrupted this video. Sometimes she interrupts, unfortunately. So this is giving human-like qualities to an animal or an object or an idea. I personify Princess Fufu on her fur book page when I give her human-like qualities. And animism is very similar, giving life to inanimate objects. So I give you the example of the fog comes on little cat feet. So the fog can't really, come on little cat feet. Apostrophe. So when we think apostrophe, we think of punctuation, where we're using an apostrophe to show possession or ownership, right? But in poetry, it refers to the act of addressing someone who isn't there or something non-human. So I give you that example, blow winds and crack your cheeks. Rhyme, we know that that's the repetition of similar or identical sounds, but there are 2 different kinds of rhyme. There's true rhyme, which is an exact rhyme like day and way, and then there's slant rhyme, which is close, but it's not an identical sound. So a good example there would be move and love. So this gives you something to write about in paper too. Is your poet using rhyme? What does that do for the poem? Or is it free verse? And if the poet is using rhyme, is it true rhyme? Is it slant rhyme? Is it a combination of the 2? So let me again sort of point out the difference between true and slant rhyme. Move and groove would be a true rhyme. They sound exactly alike. Love and above and dove would be true rhymes because they sound exactly alike. But move and love are slant rhymes because they don't sound exactly alike, but they're close. Internal rhyme is a technique where words within a line of a poem rhyme with each other. So not just the words at the end of the line, but even words within the same line may rhyme. So look to see, is your poem that you're writing about in paper 2 using internal rhyme? Alliteration, we know that that's the repetition of the same sounds. Look, I just did it with the S sound, same sounds at the beginning of words. So an example would be Langston Hughes's poem, A Dream Deferred. He repeats that D sound, right? And that's alliteration. It just adds a little sprinkling of aesthetic value to the poem. Now, assonance refers to similar internal vowel sounds like screen and beach, while consonance refers to similar internal consonant sounds like leaves and lives. So think about whether your poem is using assonance or consonants. A cacophony is a harsh, non-harmonious sound often produced by the use of hard consonants. Now, when I think of cacophony, I think of my little church in East Ridge. So we had a pianist and we had an organist, and then we had our choir director, Brother Woody, who wasn't actually formally schooled in music, and then we had Miss Eva Epperson, who sat on the front row of the choir and sang very loudly, soprano. And my father often commented that she couldn't carry a tune in a lard bucket, unquote. She was always about that much off pitch and louder than everyone else. So Brother Woody, when he would direct the choir, if he wanted you to sing faster, he'd do this. And if he wanted you to go slower, he'd do this. But it was like he was always washing an imaginary window when he was directing, and he would stomp his foot while he was doing that. So at Christmas time, our pianist did not like to play minor chords. She didn't like it. She felt that it was awfully sad, and so she just refused to play them. So when we sang a song like We Three Kings, where you have all those minor chords, the organist was still playing the minor chords, and the pianist was playing major chords. So that, combined with Brother Woody and Miss Eva, created total cacophony at my church. Yes. Now, euphony is the opposite of that, language that sounds harmonious. So, all of these terms are terms you can use in the writing of paper too, and techniques you can look for. They give you something to write about. Another one is onomatopoeia. That's just fun to say. Just say it, onomatopoeia. How fun is that? That's a technique where words sound like what they mean, like hiss, bang, boom, pop. That's onomatopoeia. It's just kind of fun. Of course, there are many, many other techniques and elements, but these are techniques that you can actually write about. Meter and rhyme. Well, we know that a syllable is any word or part of a word produced in speech by one breath. But we have syllables in poetry that are accented. That's the one that's stressed, and that it looks like a little diagonal mark just above the word where the syllable is used to mark an accented syllable, and then a little lowercase u is used to mark an unaccented syllable. So the act of marking those syllables and dividing the poem up into sections is called scansion. That's the process of discovering the dominant rhythm in a poem. Now, I will not ever ask you to scan a poem in any of our quizzes or exams, but it's good that you have a basic knowledge of what scansion refers to, and that term is probably going to come back to haunt you on that exam on literary terms later on. So a foot refers to the basic rhythmic unit of verse. Normally it consists of one accented syllable and one or two unaccented ones, but the line of a poem consists of one or more feet. So there are different kinds of feet. There's an iambic foot, today. See how the stress is placed on the second syllable? There's anapestic, intervene. So we've got three syllables with a stress on the third one. And there's dactylic, the opposite of that, yesterday. So three syllables with a stress on the first syllable. And trochaic, daily, is the opposite of iambic. So you've got two syllables with a stress on the first one, daily. So if I were scanning those words with today, I'd have a little lowercase u above the two, and above the day, I'd have that little diagonal. And that would show my reader that day is where the stress goes. So that's the process of scansion. And remember, it's not an exact science. It's just one way of describing a poem's rhythm. And so if we were scanning the same poem, we might do it a little bit differently, right? But so it isn't exact, but usually we'd be very close. And also, perfect regularity of rhythm in a poem is not necessarily a requirement in judging the quality of a poem. So, for example, my husband can write poems that are just in perfect rhythm, just like that, and boy, do they suck. Don't tell him I said that, but they are really bad. They are some bad, bad poems there. All right, so symbolism. We know that a symbol is an image that stands in for something else. It represents something else, and it suggests two or more simultaneous levels of meaning. But there are different kinds of symbolism in writing. So there's a universal symbol, and I mentioned this in the paper to assignment sheet. And that's where the associations are commonplace enough to be considered universal, so that people all over the world would get it, right? So an example might be the weather. So if we're talking about cloudy skies, that could symbolize, sadness or trouble coming, right? Numbers would be another example of symbols that are universal. A cultural symbol refers to a situation where the associations are common to a particular group or culture. So an example of that would be a flag, like the flag of our country. A contextual symbol is one where the associations that we make with it derive meaning within the context of a given work. So like the apple in Genesis or the snake in Genesis. So here's an example of the meaning of numbers. So 0 would mean eternity or infinity because it doesn't end, right? 1 might stand for unity or divinity. 2 might stand for marriage or conflict. 3, life and death, struggle, the solution of conflict, and etc. I won't bore you with going through all those, but I'll let you look at that on your own. Colors in poetry also are symbolic. So white might refer to innocence and purity and light. So that would be the positive connotation of white. The negative connotation of white might be ghost, right? Something scary. It might be the Klan, something horrifying like that. All words have positive and negative associations, connotations with them. So yellow, the color yellow might represent the sun or wisdom or light, or cowardice, like, well, he's just a yellow-bellied coward, right? Red, we might have a positive connotation like passion, or we might have a negative connotation like blood or war or temper. Don't let people tell you that we gingers have bad tempers. It's just not true. And so you get the idea, and I go through other colors there to give you ideas. Other common symbols would be water, which could represent purity, birth, or baptism. The sea, spiritual mystery, rebirth, or the unconscious. The sea could also represent a powerful force that could take us over, right, and drown us and kill us. The rising sun, birth, a beginning, enlightenment. The setting sun, death, or an ending. Circle, wholeness, unity, fusion. And there are Freudian symbols embedded within poetry. So an extended object like a knife, a sword, or a spear might represent a male, while a concave object like a cave or a room or a bowl might cause us to unconsciously think of a female. But denotation connotation, this is a critical idea that's going to haunt you again and again on quizzes, on midterms, on finals, in your writing. You've got to think about it. So when you hear that word denotation, a word's denotative meaning is its literal dictionary meaning, what you would see if you looked it up in the dictionary. But its connotative meaning, its connotation, refers to all of those associations that you make when you hear that word or see that word. all the emotional overtones, all the baggage, whether positive or negative, that word carries with it. And the first thing you want to do in understanding a poem is to consider all the wording in it and to think about the connotative meaning, the associations with each word. A lot of words have multiple connotations and even conflicting connotations. And then structure and form in poetry, and we'll spend time talking about internal and external form. It might be a narrative poem, so it concentrates on telling a story. It concentrates on action. So an example of that would be a ballad or an epic poem. It might be dramatic. So that's a poem that focuses on dialogue or presents a scene or series of scenes. It might be lyric or lyrical. I mentioned this a moment ago, and that's also called descriptive or expository. And that's a poem characterized by the emotions, the ideas, the feelings of the poet or the speaker's state of mind. And then you'll need to know what a sonnet is in that exam on literary terms later on. So it's 14 lines of iambic pentameter. That's a sonnet. And there are two types. There's the Italian, also called the Petrarchan, and there's the English, also called the Shakespearean. So you might be choosing to write paper 2 about a sonnet. And you can talk about the structure of that type of poem. So I hope that this has been helpful to you, and I will see you next time around.